Okay, so welcome back. This is the last video from me for this week. There are two more videos. One is very, very short. It's about privacy. I think it'll get you really thinking. I think it's just fantastic. And the second is a panel discussion from two experts from the law firm Clayton Utz. Talk about a range of really relevant issues, and it's pretty current. It's only been released in the last couple of months, and I think it's just spot on what I was going to talk about, said much more eloquently and with quite a bit more credibility, I suspect. So really, really strongly recommend that you take the time to watch that. Now, if you're listening to me at the moment in a podcast, you are going to need to pop on over to Canvas and you're going to need to watch those. I don't have them as audio only recordings. Well, I don't without breaching somebody else's copyright, and I'm not prepared to do that. So let's maintain that academic integrity, hey? Speaking of which, I finished the most recent video last night by challenging you to think about some of the legal considerations that Canberra-based technology company Seeing Machines and its customers might need to think about before deploying their systems. I packed up, I headed off to eat some dumplings and watch Drive to Survive with my husband, who was heading off to the Grand Prix today, and didn't really think too much of it. And then overnight, a lovely man called Dave appears to have watched my video. I assume that's how he got it anyway. And that makes me pretty happy, actually. As you know, I'm not convinced that many of you actually watch or listen to the material I prepare for you. So I was pretty surprised when I got an email this morning with basically outlining a number of the problems with the hypothetical conclusion or scenario that I ended up with. Now, I'm not going to actually ignore the question about whether or not I should be making these recordings a little bit less easy for the world at large to get hold of. But I do want to make it clear that I wasn't actually making any conclusions about Seeing Machines specifically, or these kind of companies generally. What I was trying to do at the end of that video is get you thinking about what the legal considerations are. And so, Dave, if you're out there again, hopefully this email will make that a little bit clearer, and we'll start to unpack some of the legal considerations that I imagine the team at that company would be dealing with. Need to be really clear. I've got nothing to do with that company. I have just chosen them because I love to use Australian-based examples when I can. I think they're doing some really interesting and exciting things, and I think there's a lot to unpack and to think about. So both as a person who's interested in innovation and as a person who's interested in the way the law works, I find them an absolutely fascinating case study. And again, using them as a case study of people who are going out there and building new things and going out into the world, it's really nice as a lawyer to look at case studies and think about them in this positive way rather than look at disputes, which is what we often do. We look at cases where something's gone wrong in order to understand how the world works. So for the lawyers out there, when I use the word case, I'm using it more like the business students are used to me using it, to talk about a case, a particular company, and then imagine what is really going on in there. So I started when thinking about Seeing Machines with a really obvious question, a privacy question. I asked you to think about how you might feel if your employer knew whether or not you were an above or below average driver, if they knew that you'd been alert, that you were paying attention, you were taking breaks, or even about the speed. And we're talking truck drivers here, so more than one kind of speed, if you know what I mean. So let's think about Seeing Machines as a provider of AI-driven sensor technology, about the kinds of legal considerations that they need to be aware of when they're developing, deploying, and selling their products. I've come up with a range of what I think the key legal aspects would be. Really love it if you stop the recording in a second and just made a list of as many legal considerations as you think you can come up with a view to actually seeing whether we've got the same list. You might have everything I have, you might have more. You might not think of everything I do. I'm trying to keep it pretty high level and not specific. Remember, again, I don't really know anything about this particular company. But what I want us to be thinking about is what companies like this might do. So take 5 minutes to jot down as many as you possibly can, and I'll be waiting for you. Okay, hopefully you've paused and you've come back again. So let's start with the most obvious one, privacy and data protection. The Guardian system or the Seeing Machine systems collect and process a whole heap of personal data. They necessarily collect information about people's facial features, about their driving behaviour. So it's crucial for the company to comply with a range of data protection regulations. Now, clearly, this is going to include the APPs. Now, we remember that the APPs don't apply to every Australian company. They need to have a turnover of $3 million or more. I'm going to assume that this company has that kind of turnover. I may not be correct. It may be more of a startup than I'm imagining. But even if it doesn't, the purchasers of its systems who put them into their vehicles will. So they're going to need to develop on the basis that they comply with that standard. But more than that, if this company is going to be successful, presumably it's going to be selling its technology. And in fact, it's quite clear from its website it already is selling this technology into a whole heap of European companies as well. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations from the EU, are going to be absolutely critical, which means they need to build systems that comply with those requirements. That'll mean they'll need to have processes in place for ensuring that they obtain user consent, ensuring that data security is in place. They need to implement data minimization principles. And data minimization principles are effectively about only collecting the data that you need. And these are all going to be essential aspects of their compliance programs. Remember that this can be quite tricky. The person who drives the car isn't necessarily the person who entered into the contract to purchase it. If it's collecting information about passengers, collecting that consent and that information about the passengers will also be really important. I think you understand why I've mentioned the GDPR, but I think it is important to remember that ultimately smart companies these days are needing to comply with standards, even if they don't directly relate to their jurisdiction, if they're going to be able to meet the standards that are required in the many jurisdictions that they want to trade in. The next one I have, and it wouldn't surprise me if you have too, is liability and product safety. Seeing Machines needs to ensure that its products are safe and reliable and that they function the way they're intended, that they do what it says on the tin. The company will need to be aware of potential liability issues that arise if their technology fails, if it fails to perform adequately, or if it causes some kind of harm. They're going to need to think about who the other players are and who also might be involved in that. To the extent that they get technology from third parties, they're going to need to think about the way the technologies interact with each other. They're just providing one element of all of the many, many, many parts that go into a new automobile these days. So they're going to need to think about which systems do they interface with and what does that mean. Ensuring adherence to safety standards and conducting rigorous testing and validation procedures will help them mitigate the risk of product liability claims. They might do that themselves, or they might enter into arrangements with the vehicle manufacturers. We often refer to these as OEM arrangements, original equipment manufacturing, OEM. And effectively, these are the licenses that sit underneath all the many technologies that come bundled together to result in your car or your computer or your phone, because no one person makes everything anymore. In relation to safety in particular, it's worth noting that the EU already has legislation in place that's going to require vehicles from as early as next year, 2024, through to by the end of 2026, depending on whether it's a new design or whether it's a revamping of a current design, those vehicles are going to need to have camera-based driver monitoring. Essentially, the regulator is seeing this kind of monitoring as a safety feature. Industry standards too. We've talked about industry standards a number of times along the way as we've been talking about the ways that regulation can happen. And actually, when industry takes the lead and sets reasonable standards, then we can find that they drive the regulation instead of the regulation driving the standards. We've talked about this already. It's pretty much impossible these days to get a 4 or 5 star safety rating for a new vehicle unless you've got this kind of camera technology and sensor technology embedded in. So that's clearly going to be relevant, and part of what Seeing Machines is going to need to be doing is continually monitoring what these industry standards, best practices are. It's worth noticing that this is not only happening in Europe. Apparently, President Biden has recently instructed a range of government agencies to make recommendations for the introduction of camera sensing technologies into USA cars, and specifically talked about the ways that this kind of technology could be used to passively test for people who are inebriated or might have taken drugs. If only they could use this kind of technology before they let somebody carry a gun. But hey, why carry a gun in the first place? Oh, that's right, not supposed to be being political, supposed to be teaching a class. I'll get back on it. I'm pretty sure that all of you are aware of the concerns about using mobile phones in cars, and the increased concerns that they distract people, and as a consequence there are more accidents, more injuries, and even deaths. Coinciding with this is this growing realization that truly autonomous vehicles might be decades away, but the only viable alternative to that is eyes on, hands off driving. That means that people will necessarily, or necessary is the wrong word, are likely to distract themselves. Think to the video, those of you who watched it, of the Uber safety driver in the accident that happened, that was the case study that we used a couple of weeks ago. And clearly, I don't know the facts. The case hasn't been finalised at the time that I'm speaking here. But to me, she looked like she was bored and distracted herself by going through swipe, swipe, swipe on her mobile phone. So these kinds of sensors, driver assistance systems or ADAS systems, are going to be really fundamental to keeping people alert and minimizing distraction as we get closer and closer to that truly autonomous vehicle. What did you have next? On my list, I want to talk about intellectual property. Protecting intellectual property rights associated with the kinds of technologies that companies like Seeing Machines are developing include patents, copyrights, and trade secrets. This is going to be essential to safeguarding their innovations and maintaining a competitive edge in a market. The company probably has a quite robust IP strategy in place. It will have that strategy for the purpose of securing and defending its proprietary technology and software. One of the main reasons I want you to look at the Clayton Utz video this week is there's a really interesting discussion and a great summary of the state of the law, in particular the Thaler decisions, about what happens when AI itself is involved in the development of that intellectual property. I think that's a really fascinating issue, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it with you as we move forward. The next one is industry-specific regulations, which I have touched on a little bit, but I think we need to go a bit deeper into it. Seeing Machines technology has applications across a range of different industries. Have a look at their website. They're already working in automotive, aviation, and mining, and I today decided that they should also be working with anybody who has a weapon. Just me, it's a bad day. all of these industries are going to have specific regulatory requirements that the company needs to comply with. So safety certifications and performance standards that they need to meet. Of course, each industry will also have its own best practices that they're going to keep on top of. Being able to demonstrate that they're on top of these things will help them defend themselves if actions are brought in tort in particular about some harm that's been caused if the devices that use this technology don't work the way that was expected. Another one you might not have thought of but came to my mind was export control and international trade. Clearly, this is a company that has a technology that has the potential to be used worldwide. So being aware of what the requirements are for the different markets, international markets, and different international trade laws, particularly when they're dealing cross-border or there are cross-border transactions involved as they expand their businesses globally. Complying with a range of these regulations, which may even expand to tax regulation, for example, will help prevent the unauthorised transfer or use of sensitive technology and will ensure adherence to international legal standards. Only today, this morning, I was listening to Radio National. Yes, that's how boring I am. And I was hearing Patricia Cavalis interview the CEO of TikTok. Don't worry, I won't make you listen to it. But essentially, the issue that was raised in that interview, which I thought was really interesting, is TikTok, as many of you will know, is ultimately owned by a company called ByteDance. ByteDance is a Chinese company. Now, the laws of China say if you are a Chinese national, a Chinese company, and you have data, if it's in China or if you're in China, you need to hand that data over to us if we ask you for it. Now, of course, TikTok gathers a whole lot of really sensitive information. We don't really know how its AI works, but it presumably uses the camera technology like Seeing Machines do to read reactions. Its algorithm does something with the reactions that you get to give you more content and sell more advertising. So it's gathering a whole lot of sensitive information, we assume. That could be stuff about your face, your age, your environment, your location. And a lot of this information is very sensitive because it's about children. So a lot of concern is there about what those regulations mean. Understanding what those requirements are mean that, so our CEO of TikTok was saying, walk away, nothing to see, nothing happening here. We keep our data in Singapore and the US. Now, it didn't directly, to my mind, answer the question, but was essentially saying, well, if they ask for it, it's not in China, so they can't have it. So I think there's a lot happening in that space. I think that's a really interesting issue that we should be thinking about as well. But in this context, think about the difference between that position and the GDPR position, where under the GDPR, anybody who has that data has a right to be forgotten and have a right to have that information, be told what that information is and have it effectively returned to them. One of the videos that I've asked you to watch this week is really proposing that there should be a right to have only reasonable assumptions made about you, and by extrapolating that, a right to know what it is that people have concluded about you based on the way they've aggregated your data. I think this is absolutely fascinating stuff. Now, again, I can't speak for Seeing Machines. I don't know anything about them. But if I was one of the founders of Seeing Machines, there'd be a point in time where I'd be wanting to take some big bucks and go and exit and live in a nice, quiet life with a view of the ocean somewhere. And one of the great ways to do that could well be by selling the company to someone else. Now, clearly the market for this kind of company is likely to be international. So I would be thinking that part of the legal considerations that they would have is, let's make sure that we're complying with the laws and making sure that we're ready to do business in a range of different jurisdictions, if for no other reason, and I suspect there are many other reasons, but for no other reason, so that we can sell the business in those places. Okay, what else have you got? Anything else? My next one, and I think should be on everybody's list, and we'll be talking about it a little bit more as we go forward, is cybersecurity. As the guardian system, or the system that Seeing Machines sells, relies on digital data and communication, ensuring robust cybersecurity measures are in place is going to be critical. I would be seeing that as a key risk, business and legal risk, for Seeing Machines. Presumably, they've got a comprehensive cybersecurity plan in place to protect their systems, infrastructure, and user data from unauthorized access, to protect them from data breaches and from other cyber threats. One of the reasons for doing this is by mitigating those risks, they minimize the risk of non-compliance with law, but also suit from people who are harmed as a consequence of that. If we think about the recent big tech cybersecurity breaches, Medibank, Optus, more recently Latitude, the cost to those companies of rectifying the breaches has been absolutely significant. And we're hearing about Medibank and Latitude in particular because they're ASX market listed, which means they have obligations to disclose that information. So we're getting a little bit more information than we would from otherwise private companies. The last one I'm going to share with you, possibly not really a legal consideration, but I think we need to think about the ethics. As a developer of AI-driven technology, Seeing Machines, I think, should be mindful of ethical considerations surrounding the use of AI and sensor technology. That means being alert to changes in the way the technology is being used, because not everybody uses technology in the way it was built to be used. And really understanding at a deep level what its risks are and what it is that it can do about those risks. It should be ensuring that its AI algorithms are transparent, that they're fair, and that they're unbiased. These are critical to avoiding potential ethical issues and ultimately reputational damage. Additionally, addressing concerns about surveillance and the potential misuse of collected data for purposes other than driver safety is going to be essential. So, in summary, Seeing Machines, a company about which I know nothing, but I am using it as a case study because I think it's doing some really interesting things, and it's the sort of company that I'm sure many of you would love to be legal advisors to or love to work for because it's doing such interesting, sexy tech stuff. I think it needs to be aware of a range of legal considerations as it's developing, deploying, and selling this AI-driven sensor technology. These include privacy, data protection, liability and product safety, intellectual property, industry-specific regulations and best practice, export controls, cybersecurity, and of course the ethical considerations. And doing this, the company is in a position to navigate a complex legal landscape, a complex international legal landscape, and then continue to innovate while balancing its requirements under the laws and regulations. So, Dave, I hope that answered your questions about the kind of things that we're thinking about if you've come back. I really hope, though, that you're not the only one listening to my lecture videos. And while it's been a pleasure reading your email, I also hope you don't show up at the tutorial this week, where I'm looking forward to answering any questions, dealing with any frustrations, concerns, and as always, accepting any compliments for the last week before we have a semester break. Don't forget, 2 more videos to watch. If you're listening to this as a podcast, please go back onto Canvas and watch those 2 more videos to get through all the content. Cheers!